Hey guys, it's Bella. Welcome back to my channel. I hope you guys are all having a wonderful day. I hope you're having a wonderful start to your week. In today's video, we are going to be covering another Mystery Monday case, but this is not a mystery case, it's a solved case. We're going to be talking about the case of Alison Botha, and this case is actually unbelievable. I've had so many requests to cover this, and I see why, because it is actually mind-blowing. Before we do get into the case, I just quickly want to thank today's sponsor, Care Of, for making this video possible. I have been using Care Of for years and years now to get all of my vitamins and supplements, and if you don't know, they're a subscription-based service that ships high-quality and personalized vitamins, supplements, and powders to you every single month. You can go on their website and take a 5-minute quiz, and they recommend the right vitamins and supplements for you and your goals, and you can retake this quiz anytime you want as well as your goals and your needs change, so it evolves with you. I'm iron deficient, so I take iron. I also take keratin for my hair, skin, and nails, and I recently started taking vegetarian collagen for my skin because it has just been all out of sorts since moving. I also have collagen powder for skin and nails too, so you can really see what I'm trying to target at the moment. I obviously just moved countries, a new climate. I've been traveling a lot lately as well, so my hair, my skin, and my nails, just everything is freaking out on me at the moment. Thankfully though, Care Of is really easy to travel with because they come in these little compostable packets. So if you're going for 5 days, 5 of these, chuck them in your suitcase and you're ready to go. You won't forget your vitamins. These also come with like cute little quotes, facts, goals on each packet for every day, which I love as well. So today's is a fact, and it says every 10 days your taste buds are regenerated. You learn something new every day. If you guys are interested in taking Care Of's quiz to see what vitamins and supplements they recommend for you, make sure you click the link in my description, and also make sure to use the code Isabella to get 50% off your first Care Of order. I will leave all of the information in the description down below, and let's go ahead and get into today's case. So Alison Botha was born on the 22nd of September in 1967 in Port Elizabeth to parents Brian and Claire. The family split up early on, leaving her mother Claire to care for both Alison and her brother Neil, who was 18 months older than Alison. And she had a fairly normal childhood. Eventually she went on to attend the Collegiate High School for Girls, which was also located in Port Elizabeth. She wasn't like super academic or like, you know, she wasn't really that into school or driven to any particular career path, but despite this, she did serve as the head girl for the school. And then once she graduated, she underwent secretarial studies for a year before going and traveling around the world for 4 years. She eventually returned to Port Elizabeth and started working as an insurance broker. And also just a little side note, but Port Elizabeth in 2019, the name was changed to Yebeha, I think. I've like Googled it, the pronunciation, and I just can't form the word properly, I don't know. But in 1994, when this case occurred, it was still called Port Elizabeth, and it had a population of about 900,000. It has a lot of great beaches, a lot of tourists, so it's a really popular holiday destination. It was also rated South Africa's most safe city, so it's also known as the Friendly City. So like I said, this case took place in 1994. It happened on the 18th of December in 1994 to be exact, and Alison Botha was 27 years old at the time. It was a Sunday, and Alison had spent the day with her friends at the beach, and then after the beach they decided to go back to Alison's apartment to hang out. Then at around 1 a.m. Alison drove her friend Kim home, and when she got back to her apartment she realized her typical parking spot had been taken, so she went and just parked up the road. It was within walking distance of her house, but once she parked, a man with a knife forced his way into her car and forced her over into the passenger seat. He opened the driver's side door and he held a knife to Alison's throat and said, "Move over or I'll kill you." The attacker then took control of her car and he told her, "I don't want to hurt you, I just want to use your car for an hour." While the man was driving, Alison and her kidnapper made small talk. Obviously, she doesn't want to make small talk, but she's just trying to stay alive at this point. She tells the man that her name is Susan and that she has a boyfriend waiting at home who will probably start to worry about her soon. And her kidnapper tells her that his name is Clinton. Alison told Clinton that she wouldn't report him to the police if he would just let her out of the car, and he refused. He said he he wasn't going to hurt her, and he took her to a second location where he then picked up an accomplice. The two men then took Alison to a secluded location outside or just outside of Port Elizabeth. Alison at the time obviously didn't know where this was, but it was a place called Nordhook. I'll put a little map on the screen now just so you can get an idea of how close they were to the city centre. And I'll also give a trigger warning now if you want to skip over the graphic parts of this case. It does involve strong violence and sexual assault. It is so incomprehensible and disgusting what happened to her, but I think it's important to talk about this case and what happened to her and to share her story. So the men told Alison that they were going to rape her, and they asked if she would resist. And you know, she was powerless. She just wanted to do anything she could to help herself in this situation. So she said no, that she wouldn't resist. They then forced her to remove her clothes, and the man, who said that his name was Clinton, forced her to perform oral sex on him, and then he forced the same back on her, and then he proceeded to rape her. Once he was finished, he then invited his accomplice to do the same, who then also raped Alison with his hands around her throat, after which they then suffocated her until she was unconscious. They then disemboweled her. She was stabbed at least 30 times in her abdomen and her pubic area, although this number could be in excess of 37 times. Miraculously, Alison actually survived all of this, but the men weren't done with her yet. They then slashed her throat 17 times, and when they were done, one of the men said, "Do you think she's dead?" To which the other man responded, "Nobody can survive that." One of the men who attacked Alison was particularly obsessed with mutilating her reproductive organs. So clearly, like, there was something going on here. This guy just had a deep-seated hatred for women. So after the attack, the two men drove away, and as they did, they threw Alison's clothes out of the window. But what they didn't know at the time is that Alison somehow survived this brutal attack. When Alison regained consciousness, she had no idea where she was. She was naked, lying in sand in the middle of nowhere, and despite her injuries and despite everything she had gone through, she actually wrote what she believed her attackers' names were in the sand, so that if she didn't make it, these men would hopefully face some sort of consequences. And the men's names that she wrote were Franz and Tiens, and then underneath their names, and this is like honestly one of the most heartbreaking things, like it actually choked me up when I was looking into this, but under their names she wrote in the sand, "I love you, mum." Now after writing the men's names in the sand, she just kind of laid there for a while because obviously her injuries were so incredibly severe. I cannot even comprehend it. Like, I can't even imagine the strength that it took her to then find the will to get up and move despite what she had gone through and despite her injuries and probably the blood loss. Like, everything would have just been a daze and so confusing. I can't even begin to imagine. But after laying there for a while, she found the will to get up. She saw cars' headlights in the distance, and she thought, if I can just get to that road, then I might have a chance of survival. Initially, she tries to crawl to this road or to where the headlights are, and she realizes that's not going to work, so she tries to stand up. And this is when she realizes just how severe her injuries are, because when she stands up, her head actually falls back because she has been nearly decapitated. So her head cannot stay upright. It's like hanging on by a thread, and she has to hold her head on as she walks towards these headlights. And not only did she have to hold her head with one hand, but she could feel her organs coming out of her abdomen. So she had this denim shirt, and she had to use the other hand to hold this denim shirt against her organs to keep her organs inside her stomach. So with one hand she's holding her organs in, and with the other hand she's holding her head upright on her head while walking towards these headlights. Like, I actually just can't even fathom it. I cannot. What's also crazy is that her windpipe had actually been crushed. So regularly she wouldn't be able to breathe, but the slashes across her throat actually created an opening that allowed her to breathe. Her vision was also coming in and out. At some point she could only see black, which only made it more difficult for her to get to the road. And it was a really long and painful thing for her to get to this road. And when she did get to the road, she she just collapsed in the middle of it. She couldn't make it any further, and she just laid there and hoped that somebody would stop and would find her there and help her. And it was 2 a.m. by this point that she got to the road. And thankfully there were still cars driving around, one of which kind of started driving up towards her, stopped in the middle of the road, and at this point she was kind of overthinking everything. She was like, could this have been a really bad idea? Could this be the men who kidnapped me? But she was willing to take that risk because it was the only chance she really had. So this car stopped in front of her, a little bit away from her, in the middle of the road, and nobody got out of the car. So she kind of just put her hand up and sort of started waving, and then this car just drove off and left her there. You know, in a way this is kind of a hard sort of situation because obviously this woman is so desperately in need of help, but I feel like you would sort of be scared that it's someone setting you up, like somebody's just got fake blood on themselves, they're lying in the middle of the road, and as soon as you go to help them they like get up and like have a knife or something, especially at 2 a.m. in the morning. Like it's a bit scary. But after what she went through, I just feel like you would see her and know that this is real. Like the injuries that she had, there's no way someone's faking that to set up a robbery, you know? But I also don't know what she looked like from the car's perspective, like if she's lying down, if they can't really see the injuries, but the injuries seem so bad I feel like they would have been able to see. I don't know, it's a very conflicting one. Thankfully though, another car wasn't far behind, and at 2:45 a.m. another car pulled up, and thank God the guy in this car was a young man named Tian Alert, and he decided to stop and get out of the car and help Alison. And by this point it had been about an hour and a half since she had first been abducted. Tian got out of the car to go and help her, but she could barely communicate because of her severe injuries. She looked terrified and her eyes were bloodshot. There were multiple other people in the car with Tian, and thankfully one of them had a mobile phone, and so they called emergency services to come and help. And it's actually pretty lucky that somebody happened to have a mobile phone because this was 1994. Like obviously mobile phones were not as common as they are today. And what's also lucky is that Tian was a veterinary student, so he had kind of like a basic like medical understanding, I guess, enough so that he was able to help put Alison's thyroid back inside her body and then kind of take care of her until emergency services arrived. And he was providing her with emotional and medical support until they did get there. So he was trying to keep her awake with small talk. Even though she couldn't talk, she couldn't respond, she could squeeze his hand once for yes and twice for no. And thank God he was there to do this. Thank God he was there to like keep her awake and keep her responding through these hand squeezes, because emergency services, it took them so long to come. It took 4 phone calls and 1 hour and 45 minutes until they came out and took Alison to the hospital. And then on the way to the hospital, apparently they were just like driving really slowly, and Tian said to them like, can you guys go a bit faster? Like she is dying back there. And they refused. Apparently there was just no sense of urgency. I don't know if it's because they thought, you know, her injuries are so bad she's probably unable to be saved or what, but there was just no sense of urgency. Like they just didn't care. They were driving so slowly. They took 1 hour and 45 minutes to come out there, 4 phone calls before they came. Like it's just so unacceptable. Like Alison was literally hanging on by a thread. Every second counts. Eventually they did get to the hospital, like by the grace of God, and one of the doctors who treated Alison, he said that Alison's injuries were the most severe he had ever seen in his 16 years of practice. When he and his colleagues were assessing her, they realized she had been completely disemboweled. There were loops of her small intestine sitting on top of her stomach. Her abdomen had been completely contaminated with beach sand and charcoal, and after inspecting her injuries further, they realized that she would likely never be able to carry a child either. The general surgeon who was called in to operate on Alison, his name was Dr. Dmitry Angelov, and he was shocked by her injuries as well. He said they gave a striking impression of cruelty. And you know, doctors, surgeons, nurses, I feel like they can be a little bit desensitized to injuries and that sort of thing because they see them all the time. So when they are like genuinely shocked by injuries, you know it's really bad. I mean, when she first arrived at the hospital, I don't think anybody thought that she was going to be able to survive her injuries, and they were completely shocked that she had even made it this far. And despite the unlikelihood that she would make it, the medical team did absolutely everything they could to save her. As I mentioned, Tian had actually pushed her thyroid back inside her body, and as it turns out, her thyroid had actually been cut in half, which is like potentially fatal. Not potentially fatal, it should be fatal, because a small puncture or a small cut is potentially fatal. So it really goes to show you just how strong she is that she's been able to make it this far. Her intestines had been ruptured and punctured in several places, and you know, there were all of these stab wounds which somehow managed to miss all of her vital organs. They began operating on Alison as soon as they possibly could, and as they did so, they had to meticulously clean every single one of her organs of the sand and the charcoal that was all in there, and they had to do this before putting each of her organs back in place. So this surgery lasted 3 hours. Miraculously, Alison survived. Dr. Angelov puts her survival down to being a miracle, but I do think that her surgeons and her doctors and her nurses really deserve the utmost respect for doing everything they could to save her. I mean, I do understand why they called it a miracle, because I think, you know, despite the fact that they did everything they could, it's a miracle that she even made it to the hospital alive. Despite her throat being slit 17 times and nearly decapitating her, none of the major blood vessels or nerves in her neck were severed or damaged. The stab wounds around her abdomen somehow didn't get any of her vital organs when the blade went through. And it's also incredibly lucky that Alison didn't suffer any infections after the surgery as well. But she wasn't completely out of the woods yet. She was still, you know, practically on the brink of death. Despite all of this, despite trying to recover and everything that she had gone through though, she surprisingly remembered a lot of details from the attack and about her attackers, which really helped police to track down her perpetrators. Not even 12 hours after her attack, she was awake in the hospital and able to talk to police and assist them with their investigation. Police were able to show her multiple photos of different potential suspects, and she was able to point 2 of these photos out and say, these were the 2 men that attacked me. One of them was a man named Franz de Toit, and the other one was a man named Tians Kruger. And Alison was actually able to write the first names of these men on each of their corresponding photos. Both of these men were already known to police. Both had previously been arrested for rape. Franz had actually been arrested for the rape of 2 women, and Tians had been arrested for the rape of 1 woman. And they were both awaiting their trials, and somehow, while awaiting their trials for rape, they were just like allowed out. They were just like out raping another woman, almost killing a woman while they awaited their trial. I just do not understand. I just don't know how that was allowed to happen. And what's crazy is they didn't even have to pay bail. They were just allowed out on their own recognizances while they waited for their trial, for their rape trials. I don't know, it's just so mind-blowing to me, because obviously they're just, you know, if they did rape these women, then they're just free to go and do it again while they wait to be convicted of it. I don't know, like, what is that? How can you be suspected of 2 different rapes and you're just, I actually have no words. So how? I get that at the time it's just alleged, like they haven't been convicted of anything, but when it's something as severe as rape and you're going to trial for it, I just feel like you need to be held. I'm like at a loss for words about this. It's just so crazy to me. The police's excuse for why Franz was allowed out was because apparently there was no evidence of the rape, because the survivor reported it a week after it happened, and they also said he had a stable employment and a permanent address, which I guess to them was a sign that he wasn't going to flee or commit another rape somehow, because he has a job. And then obviously he was being accused of 2 different rapes, and the second rape, the reason they didn't hold him is because there was no investigating officer. So when he and Tians were brought in for this second rape, they didn't know that Franz had previously been accused of another rape. I don't know why they weren't detained for this second rape. Like, even if they didn't know about the first one, I don't know why they weren't detained for this second one at all. They were both just like allowed to go out after doing it. Oh, you guys were accused of rape, no worries, you go out, do it again, have fun. Now, this part I thought was a little strange as well. Even after Alison had identified the men and like, you know, identified their photos, written their names on the back of their photos for identification, they said that it would make the prosecution against them stronger if she could verbally identify them, which, you know, for obvious reasons was going to be difficult. She was almost decapitated. She had a ventilation tube providing oxygen to her lungs, so she couldn't talk. The doctors also didn't want to remove these tubes so soon after surgery because they didn't want to damage her throat anymore, but because, you know, officers were kind of insisting that this would make the prosecution stronger, the doctors presented the idea to Alison and she said, you know, if we have to do it, let's do it. So doctors removed her ventilation tube from her throat and she was able to say, my attackers were Franz and Tians. Franz and Tians were arrested on the 19th of December at approximately 5 a.m. They were charged with an array of offences, including kidnapping, rape, and the attempted murder of Alison, and the media labelled them the Nordhook Ripper Rapists. One of the police officers who interviewed Franz initially said that Franz was confused when he was told he was being charged with attempted murder. The officer explained that Alison had survived the attack, and this is when Franz basically said, well, then there's nothing I can hide from you because she will obviously tell you everything that happened. He then pulled a bloodstained ring from his pocket, handed it to the officer, and said this belonged to Alison. Obviously, they went and did tests on this ring and confirmed that the blood on the ring did belong to Alison. He also allegedly confessed to raping a pregnant woman 2 weeks earlier and handed over a knife to the police that he had used in this attack. So obviously this guy is just literal scum of the earth. I'm just going to give a little bit of background information on him, Franz, and Tians, the two rapists who attempted to murder Alison. Like I said before, even prior to this incident, these guys were already on the police's radar for just being some of the most despicable humans to ever walk the planet. I'm so glad that they were eventually caught, but it's just so frustrating. That's not even the right word. Like, it's not even enough of a word to describe what it is, but it's so frustrating what had to happen for them to be caught and how many women had to go through such heartbreaking things before these men were caught. It was honestly really hard to research this case and look into this case because of how traumatic what these women had to go through is. Like, the recounts of what they had to go through is devastating. The first woman that Franz raped was a 20-year-old student, and she's the one that took a week to come forward. And the reason she took a week to come forward is because Franz threatened to kill her if she did speak up about what happened. The second woman was a 21-year-old pregnant woman, and she came forward almost immediately, despite the fact that Franz also threatened to kill her if she came forward. As we know though, while they were awaiting trial, they were both let out. No bail, nothing. So in 1994, when the attack against Alison happened, Franz Dutoit was 26 years old. He was the son of a police officer and he was raised in a Christian household. He was expelled from 8th grade for setting a fire to a dormitory, which encouraged his parents to move to the nearby town of Adelaide. It was around this time that he supposedly became involved in Satanism, something which actually turned out to be a major talking point of this case, which I will touch on later. Franz was a terrible student. He failed 9th grade twice, and I think failing 9th grade twice was the last straw for his parents because they sent him to the army after this. When he eventually left the army, his parents helped him get a job at a mine in Welcome in the Free State, and during this time here he married a woman and fathered a daughter, although Franz later abandoned his family because his wife apparently didn't satisfy him sexually. After abandoning his family, he moved to Port Elizabeth, where his parents helped him get another job as a driver for a chain of stationery shops. He was eventually fired from this job as his employer found out that he had stolen money, and for this he received a suspended sentence of 3 years. After losing his job, Franz opened something called a shebeen, which is like an illegal alcohol store, and this is where he actually met Tians, who was a customer, and they first came into contact about 4 months before the rape took place. Franz went on to marry another the woman who he fathered a son with. This was his second child, obviously, but from what I understand, this was the only child that lived with him at the time of Alison's attack because, you know, like I said, he abandoned his other family. Tians Kruger was only 19 years old when he and Franz raped Alison in 1994. His father had abandoned him and his mother shortly after his mother fell pregnant with him. Eventually, she remarried, but this was once again short-lived. Eventually, another man came into the picture and the family moved to Tsitsikamma, which is on the southeastern coast of South Africa. I did read reports online that this new stepfather may have been violent toward Tians, but I couldn't find a whole lot to back this claim up, so take it with a grain of salt. Tians allegedly did have quite a rough childhood though. He was bullied for having a third nipple and called dritiet, which translates to three-tit, and all of this pushed Tians down a path of depression and he eventually turned to drugs and alcohol. He left school in the 10th grade and joined the army, similar to, you know, our friend Franz, and he also allegedly had some ties to Satanism, but I couldn't find a lot of information about his involvement with that. The morning after they raped and attempted to kill Alison as well, allegedly they just had breakfast like normal and had the bloody knife that they had used to slit her throat and disembowel her just sitting on the table while they ate breakfast together. I just feel goes to show like how little remorse they had, and by little remorse I mean no remorse. They had no remorse for their actions. On the 29th of December, Franz and Tians appeared before the magistrate's court and they were ordered to undergo 30 days of psychiatric evaluation, and during that time they were held at Pollsmoor prison. The two of them both indicated that they were going to plead guilty, but the police continued their investigation, collected DNA from both men and analysed and examined the crime scene just in case, you know, they could always change their minds and decide to plead not guilty, so it's important to have all of the information at hand. While all of this was going on, Alison was still recovering. She wasn't out of the woodwork yet and still had to undergo more surgeries. She was discharged from the hospital just before the new year, but she still had to go back to hospital every single day to have her wounds treated. She still had some horrendous injuries and a long road to recovery. The worst of her injuries was probably the abdomen. She had to go in every day to have the wounds scraped until they bled so that new cells could grow. She also had to undergo plastic surgery, and to this day, she still lives with pain and ongoing medical complications as a result of her injuries. But she is alive, you know, against every odd, she survived. On the 23rd of March, Franz and Tians had their pre-trial hearing. They were going up against 8 charges, multiple counts of abduction, indecent assault and rape. They were also being charged with 1 count of attempted murder and 1 count of robbery, and they pled guilty to all 8 charges. Franz, however, pled not guilty to the charge for his first rape that he committed. Nobody knows why he pled not guilty, but it's assumed that it's because there was a lack of physical evidence because she came forward a week after the incident happened, so he just assumed due to the lack of physical evidence he could just kind of take a chance and plead not guilty on that one. On the 12th of June in 1995, the trial started and it seemed to be the only thing the media were talking about, and it was still and still is one of the most high profile cases in the history of South Africa. In preparation for the trial, Alison went to see a clinical psychologist to assess her emotional state, and part of what was documented by the psychologist was that Alison did not express the typical feelings of a rape survivor, such as fear, anger, shame, helplessness, and disintegration. She appeared to be quite composed after the attack, and this was due to her hardened personality style. And obviously it's hard to classify somebody's response to a rape. Everybody is different. Everybody responds in different ways, and I'm by no means a psychologist, so I don't really fully grasp this analysis, but apparently there's like 3 main types of responses. There's an expressed response, a controlled response, and a shocked response. So an expressed response would be somebody expressing, you know, hysterically or very agitated about the attack, and then there's the controlled response, which is where somebody is kind of they don't really show any emotion about it. And then the shocked response is typically when someone shows disorientation about what happened to them. So this can present itself in like confusion or not really remembering a lot of details. And the findings of Alison's psychological evaluation is that she was most likely showing a shocked response, and she was in a prolonged state of shock. Now, at the time that this case took place in South Africa, they actually had a law there where the victim would have to put their hand on the perpetrator or the attacker's shoulder and get a photo like that to kind of prove that the victim was pointing out the perpetrator as the perpetrator, I guess. Which, I mean, is kind of ridiculous because in Alison's case, she's already pointed him out or pointed them out in two different ways. She wrote their names on the back of photos, and then she also like said it out loud. And I can only imagine how traumatic it would be for victims to have to go and touch their attacker and take a photo with their attacker. It just, you know, does not seem necessary, especially after going through something so incredibly traumatic. So thankfully in this case, actually, they came up with this idea for a different way for Alison to identify them a third time. I don't even know why this was necessary. She's already identified them a bunch, but the third time she identified them, instead of taking a photo with her placing her hand on their shoulder, she was able to identify them through a one-way glass. And this is now actually the common practice in South Africa. So no more of that having to touch and take a photo with your perpetrator, thankfully. On the very first day of the trial, Franz and Tian's attorney, a guy named Henry Lerm, actually said that he could no longer represent the men, citing ethical reasons. The first witness that was heard from in the trial was the first woman that Franz raped alone, the 20-year-old student, and he would actually be convicted on 4 charges. 2 counts of rape, 1 count of indecent assault, and 1 count of abduction, although this kind of would all be tallied on to his sentence later. On the second day of the trial, they also had the 21-year-old pregnant woman testify, the one who both Franz and Tian's raped. And then on the third day of the trial, it was Alison's time to testify. During the trial, there was also testimony from Tian, who, if you remember, is the man who pulled over and got out of his car and actually helped Alison. And he was a vet at the time, but I think now, or at the time of the trial, he was working towards becoming or was a human doctor. There was also a 4th woman who gave testimony that she was almost a victim of Franz and Tian's the night before Alison was raped and almost murdered. She said that she noticed the 2 men watching her while she was driving up the street trying to find a park, but she just kind of parked anyway. And then once she did park, Franz came up to her front door and tried to force his way in, but she thankfully locked the door. They couldn't get in, and then they just kind of ended up walking away. Tian's didn't give testimony at the trial. I'm not sure why. I guess he was just ready to face whatever was coming. He'd already made his plea, pled guilty, and I think he probably just knew there was no getting out of it no matter what he said. Franz, however, did testify at the trial, and he basically admitted to being a Satanist. He said that it was a demon called Incubus who told him to rape all of the women and try to murder Alison. And it honestly came off a bit like he was trying to, I don't know, take a little bit of the blame off himself. He was trying to reduce his culpability, and it's how he was like trying to justify his crimes, you know, like it was the devil made me do it, it wasn't me. While he was being detained before the trial, he allegedly asked the officers to have like a pastor come and give him an exorcism, and this was granted. So a pastor came, gave him an exorcism, and according to one of the officers there, he kept referencing 2 demons, one called Incubus and one called Succubus. And according to this officer, he kept getting the 2 demons confused, so kind of embarrassing. Not a very good actor, like at least have your details straight. But it also just kind of proved that all of this was just kind of a game to him. Like he couldn't even get the 2 devils right. He was obviously just putting on this whole act, and the media really latched on to this whole Satanism angle and probably really fueled the notoriety of these 2 men. Now, something surprising about his testimony as well is that he apparently downplayed Tian's involvement quite a lot and said that Tian was like very shocked when Franz strangled Alison. And he even went as far as to say that when he got in the car, he actually just thought that Alison was a friend of Franz's. Like, he didn't know that they were going to go and rape this woman and that all of this was going to happen. During his testimony, he also gave detailed accounts of each rape that he committed. I think by this point, he had already been found guilty of the first woman's rape despite pleading not guilty, but he hadn't been sentenced for this. Like, it was all kind of gonna get grouped together at the end once the full trial was over. He gave this like really half-assed apology at the end, which was almost like a joke. It was like, I don't know how I'll ever be able to forgive myself again, sort of thing. By the end of the trial, both men were found guilty on all 8 charges, and then Franz was found guilty on an extra 4 charges for the initial rape that he committed of the 20-year-old student by himself. This included 2 counts of rape, 1 count of indecent assault, and 1 count of abduction. And then on the 7th of August in 1995, which is actually just 2 months after South Africa abolished the death penalty, they abolished the death penalty on like the 6th of June 1995, which honestly I guess is kind of lucky, because I don't believe in the death penalty, because I think people who deserve the death penalty actually deserve to rot in prison. Like, it's almost an easy way out to just be sentenced to death. So in my opinion, it was kind of a good thing that it was abolished 2 months before they... But anyway, on the 7th of August 1995, Franz du Toit was sentenced to 3 life sentences without the possibility of parole. And Tians Kruger was sentenced to 1 life sentence and 25 years with no parole. So Franz was given a life sentence for each of the women he raped, and Tians was given a life sentence only for Alison, and then 25 years for the pregnant 21-year-old that he raped with Franz. What's crazy as well is that if they were sentenced 2 months prior, they likely would have gotten the death penalty. Judge Jansen, the judge on the case, said that if it was considered constitutional, then he would have considered it and probably would have imposed it. So after sentencing, Franz is being held at the Groote prison, and Tians is being held at the Pretoria Central Prison in the CMAX section. In June of 2011, legislation came into effect in South Africa where anybody who had been sentenced to a lifelong sentence in prison and had already served 13 years and 4 months by this point would be eligible for parole, which meant that Franz and Tians would be eligible for parole, which obviously is something that was heavily opposed by Alison and the general public. Like, these guys are a danger to society. They should never be allowed out of prison. They should never be allowed to walk free amongst other people, in my opinion. There was actually a petition that was created to make sure that they don't get parole, that they stay behind bars, and to my knowledge, they haven't been granted parole and they are still behind bars to this day. At this time, Franz was being talked about in the media for another reason. There were allegations that he was apparently having an online relationship with an American woman named Sabrina, and Sabrina ended up coming out after their relationship ended and said that she was scared for her life, and she also claimed that Franz was involved in criminal activities even while still in prison, which I think is crazy, because who the hell would want to work with this guy? Franz's father, who was a police officer, actually ended up ending his own life because he couldn't deal with the shame of knowing what his son had done. Now, since all of this has happened and since recovering from her attack, Alison has made it her mission to share her story around the world and is a successful motivational speaker. What started out as something to help combat her depression turned out to be something she was deeply passionate about and has resulted in the release of both a book and a documentary. Alison also won the Rotary and Paul Harris Award for Courage Beyond the Norm in 1995 for becoming the first South African woman to speak publicly about the experience of rape. That same year, she also received the Femina magazine's Woman of Courage Award and was announced Port Elizabeth's Citizen of the Year. And honestly, I think this is maybe one of the only good things that came out of this case, because it really put a spotlight on how many rape cases get swept under the rug all around the world, and particularly in South Africa. Alison really took a stand and she held her attackers responsible for what they did to her. And it's incredible that she was able to survive such a brutal and traumatizing ordeal. In 1997, she also got married to a man named Tierney, and then 5 years later, in 2003, she gave birth to her first child, a son named Daniel, and then in 2006, she gave birth to her second child, a son named Matthew. Tian, the man who stopped to help Alison on the road, actually ended up, you know, he was a vet at the time. He ended up becoming a doctor, like for humans, not for animals. And he actually ended up being the assisting doctor for the birth of Alison's second son. Alison talked about in her book and her documentary about how as soon as the second man got in the car, she knew it was over for her. She didn't think that she would be going home that night. She also spoke about how after the rape and throughout most of the attack and after the attack, she really couldn't feel anything. Like she couldn't even feel pain. And that's obviously probably due to the shock that she was feeling. She also talked about how while she was like lying in the sand, windpipe severed, like after they had just left her for dead, she actually like left her body, and it's almost like she was so close to death that she experienced death, but she was able to bring herself back almost. She was able to pull herself together and find that will to live. I mean, honestly, this is just one of the most unbelievable and insane cases I have ever heard of. Thinking about her holding her head on and holding her organs inside her body while walking to that road, it's truly unfathomable. And no matter how many cases I cover, I am still astounded every single time by the disgusting subhumans that walk this earth and what they're capable of. It honestly makes me sick to my stomach. And you know, Alison was one of the lucky ones, would you believe? Like she survived. And when I say lucky, obviously she's not lucky that this happened to her, but she's lucky that she survived such an ordeal and she's still here to share her story and share her strength and her courage where so many women are not. And while it's not a happy story, it's an incredible story of survival and strength, and it really speaks to how your courage and your mental strength can help you through the most difficult situations. But that is it. That's everything from me today. That's all for this video. I would love to discuss your thoughts in the comments down below, because although it's a really hard story to talk about, I think it's a really important conversation to have. So I'd love to hear your thoughts and your opinions. I'll be reading all of the comments as always. But that's everything. That's all for this video. I hope you guys enjoy the rest of your day, the rest of your week, and hopefully I will see you in my next video. Bye guys.